you should deconstruct the cool things that you see in life. Like when you come across something that you really like or that you think's cool. So in my case, like I was writing a book. So how do I deconstruct bestsellers? Like what's going on there? And if you find a single example of something, it doesn't really tell you anything. But if you start to find patterns, then that's probably something to pay attention to. So I think actually this is a great segue to kind of some of these examples I was going to give. So let's say when I was writing Atomic Habits early on, I was like, I know what I'm trying to achieve. I'm trying to write the most comprehensive and most useful book that's ever been written on habits. Now, I have no idea if I achieved that, and it's not really for me to decide, if we're being honest. Like, I don't get to choose that it did that. That's up to the readers to decide, is that a mark that you hit or not? But I think that has to be the target. You got to start there. Otherwise, you're never just going to stumble into that outcome, So like you have to like try to intend to create something great. So how do we do that? I looked at a bunch of books, not just about habits, but also other bestsellers. One of the first things I did was I went to the table of contents for all those books. And then I was like, how are these books arranged? And what you'll find is that a lot of best-selling books, they have they break things into thirds, or it doesn't always have to be thirds, but they have like a clear structure that the book goes through so that you can look at the table of contents. And even though you don't know what's in the chapters, you know exactly where you're headed as a reader. What people don't want is they don't want to open up a book and feel lost, feel like I have no idea where this guy's going to go with this. And it kind of feels like they're wasting their time. So a couple examples you could do, and I thought about these, but I didn't actually use these for Atomic Habits. I could have had a table of contents that was like habits of the past, habits of the present, habits of the future. You know pretty clearly like where that book's going to go if you see those categories in the table of contents. Or Power of Habit is another example. If you look at the table of contents there, I think he does habits of individuals, habits of businesses, and then habits of societies. So it's like individuals, organizations, societies. And you can see how he's kind of moving up the hierarchy as you go through the book. And another one that I looked at, I can't remember which one of Cal Newport's books it was, but it was either Deep Work or something like that. But he had a section on here are the rules that you need to follow. And then there were, 4 rules or 6 rules. And so each one of those got their section in the book. And the point is just, there needs to be a clear roadmap for the reader. And if you start looking through what other bestsellers are doing, you can start to think about how to transport that onto your own experience. Another thing I did was I tried to look at what is the average chapter length for a lot of these books. When I signed the book deal, the publisher and the editors I was working with, which I love my publishing team, by the way, but they were kind of encouraging me to write longer chapters, like 6,000 or 8,000 words. And I was coming at this as like a blogger, like most of the things I wrote were like 2,000 words or 1,500 words. And eventually what I settled on was most of the chapters were between 2,000 and 3,000 words. And that felt like the right length,
Yep. And just for folks to have a reference point, I mean, one printed page, what would you say? It's roughly like 300 to
Yeah, I think
words.
Most of my chapters were about 10 pages. So,
yeah.
So 300 words. Yeah. If it's a 3,000 word chapter, maybe it's 10 or 12 pages, something like that. So yeah, figuring out the length. And I started to notice other things that like novels would do, or books that weren't necessarily nonfiction. The chapters are really short and there's kind of this momentum that gets into it. Like it kind of gets you flipping pages and it's easier to keep churning through the chapters. And so I wanted to have that kind of chapter length. I actually think Atomic Habits is still a little bit longer than I was hoping. I just couldn't figure out how to compress it more. My initial manuscript for the book was 700. It was like 712 pages or something. And the finished version of the book is like 250. So, I compressed it by, 66% or whatever. So it's much smaller than what it started out as, which I think is good because I feel like a lot of books, especially business books, they could have been like a blog post or a 20-page paper and they get turned into a 200-page book. So I wanted to do the opposite.
I fucking hate that. It's the worst. It's so bad.
But I actually think if you look at books that sell really well, a lot of the time they're like 180 to 220 pages. They're actually even a little bit shorter than what I ended up hitting. So these are all examples of deconstructing, bestsellers and what's going on. Probably the most important place to do this is with titles. So I have a spreadsheet of hundreds of titles for books. The way that I did it was I said, I'm only going to look at books that have sold 1 million copies or more. That's what I'm trying to achieve. So let me just see how many books I can find that have done that. And
quick question, tactical question. Did you do that through access to Nielsen BookScan? asking a publisher for help with Publishers Marketplace?
I didn't have access to BookScan because I was just a poor blogger who was, trying to make a book. So I didn't have access to any of that stuff. But what I did was I just did tons of Google searches.
Yeah.
And usually what happens is that when an author hits 1 million copies or 4 million or whatever.
Yeah. They'll let you know.
Yeah, they let you know. And so there's all kinds of stuff. Or you'll find like, if you just search a title and then copies sold, there's New York Times articles that profile an author and they say, their book sold 6 million copies or whatever. So it was just a bunch of legwork like that. Anyway, I put together that spreadsheet. Let's say I got like 150 titles or something. And then I started to look for patterns. So what format do all these titles follow? And I think I ended up coming up with, there are about 6. I won't be able to remember them all off the top of my head, but the most common format is the blank of blank. So the power of habit, the life-changing magic of tidying up, the power of now, the power of positive thinking, the subtle art of not giving a fuck, the blah, blah, blah. So it's always the blank of blank. And that's a very proven, the war of art. It's a very proven format. And the psychology of money, like we can just keep going on and on and on. There's so many examples like that. And usually what people do is they take their topic, and that's the second piece, and then they take some type of descriptor, and that's the first one. And ideally, you're combining things that are not usually combined. So like the life-changing magic of tidying up. So tidying up is the topic of the book, but now you're telling me that it's life-changing. And what you find is a lot of these best-selling books, they have some element of contrast in the title. There's something that's unexpected about it. So even another common format is you just
subtle
take, and this is
of not giving a fuck, right? You don't usually make subtle art.
Like, yeah, the F word is actually the least subtle thing, right? So like there's this interesting contrast between the two. Another common format, this is the one that I use for Atomic Habits, is you take the topic of your book and then you layer on some kind of unexpected descriptor before it. So I'll get to Atomic Habits in a second, but like extreme ownership by Jocko. So the idea is you take ownership and responsibility for your life, but you do it like in this extreme way. It's not just like a regular idea of taking ownership. Or Cal Newport, deep work. You're doing work, but it's a special kind of work. It's not the normal type of thing that you're thinking about. So these are just examples. There are a couple more patterns that I found, and then ultimately you got to decide like which one makes the most sense for me, which one feels like it's the best fit for my book. But I started to generate a bunch of titles.
And which one can you live with forever?
Yes. Titles are really tricky because they need to pass a lot of filters. They need to be about, like, they need to cover what the book is actually about. So like in my case, it needed to actually talk about habits. I think it's important to have some element of contrast. So like in my case, atomic has multiple meanings. It can be tiny or small, so your habit should be easy to do. It can be the fundamental unit in a larger system. So like atoms built into molecules, and systems versus goals is like a big part of the book. It can be the source of immense energy or power. So I think if you kind of combine all those 3 meanings, you get the like big arc of the book, which is you make changes that are small and easy to do. You layer them on top of each other like units in a larger system. And then you end up with these kind of powerful or remarkable results as a byproduct. So for all of those reasons, I kind of felt like atomic was a great word to describe it. But it needs to describe what the topic is. It needs to be interesting and compelling, or like a little bit different. Sometimes good habits are like a little bit weird in a sense. Like nobody was really using the phrase atomic habits before the book came out. It wasn't like a way that you would describe a habit. You might describe it as small, but you wouldn't describe it as like atomic.
If it had been good habits, just for people out there, right? You're going to be competing with the entire internet.
Yes.
For search results.
I actually think a lot of titles fall into this pitfall, which is they use a phrase that is commonly used, and you want a phrase that you can like own in the reader's mind. Like you don't want to be competing with, all the other things that use the phrase good habits. 4-Hour Workweek is a good example of this. Nobody really used that phrase before the book. It was like a little bit weird.
Yeah.
In the sense that it wasn't part of normal conversation, and that allowed you to own it.
Mm-hmm.
It also had that element of contrast where you're like, man, I work for 40 hours a week. You're telling me I can work for 4, so like it's this surprising thing. Another example of that might be like Rich Dad, Poor Dad, so that book has this element of contrast between the two. So it needs to be like something that you actually want. It needs to cover the topic of the book. It needs to have this element of contrast. Like there's a lot of filters for it to pass. And that's why coming up with good titles is hard.